Hi, and welcome. Welcome to my tree ship here. And welcome to yet another video where I try to lay out and explain some of the teachings of synergetics, if you like. Well, spherical thinking, spherical being, synergetics, as Bucky called it, Buckminster Fuller. What I also would like to consider the way of the spheres. And while I still intend to do another video particularly explicitly on the topic of the so-called Platonic solids and an in-depth deconstruction of that construct of our mind, and I equally still intend to do a whole deep dive on Pythagoras' Tetractys as a simple and rather beautiful demonstration and model of space-time that is completely congruent and complementary with synergetics. Today I thought I'd do another try. This is not the first time I'm talking about this matter, but I think I've never had this level of models available for the demonstration to really emphasize and drive home the point that I want to make. So, what point is that? Well, today, dear fellow human, today my intention is to lay bare the overwhelming shortcomings that the current consensus, the current convention of geometry with regards to specifically our reality, the shortcomings of that, because there are plenty. And I promise you I won't bore you with too many of them. But there is at least one specific argument that I want to lay out and demonstrate and bring to our attention and bring to mind. And that is the incongruence of a static three-dimensional space with our actual embodied reality. So you may have heard me talk before about manufactured reality, which is essentially my way of calling the fact that within at least what we call the civilized world, the colonized world, this frame of mind that is defined in terms of the ancient Greek geometries and subsequent levels of further abstraction brought to them. This frame manifests in our manufactured reality insofar as that almost everything that we are encountering in terms of things that people made, be they buildings or furniture or books or pictures or anything really, the entire hardware and software of the so-called World Wide Web, all of these things are fundamentally based on an underlying agreement. Now, these agreements in their Greek word are called axioms. And the entirety of Greek metaphysics of geometry is axiomatic. So everything about these fundamental statements is to be accepted without proof. That's what axioms mean. On the contrary, in synergetics, everything is scientifically sound, and so far as we only accept as generalizable principles those facts that we can actually model and demonstrate and embody. And these two branches of one root called geometry, these two branches are vastly different. They couldn't be more different. So, what I want to address today in particular is the misconceptions around what we call vertical and horizontal. And, you know, if I was a traditional geometer or still beholden to that frame of mind, I would begin by saying, imagine. Imagine we're building a house. However, I'm not. I'm actual. I'm more concerned with factual reality. So I'm not gonna ask you to imagine anything. I'm just gonna drop this here. So here is what on the first glance appears to be the frame of conception that, you know, the building block of our civilization, meaning a hexahedron, as the Greek called it, a cube. However, you may notice that this one isn't really all that stable at all. It's not actually a form, nor is it a volume. And I've done this plenty times. It can actually do, it can actually embody various more relevant and more substantial aspects of space-time and its geometries, while being sadly rather incapable of doing what it is proclaimed to be doing, which is to define a volume of static space. So, first of all, to realize this, we will need to round, or actually what we do need is to put in structure. And I've got some here. Alas, this is of the same identical length as these straws here of that cubic frame, so it wouldn't hold that one. We need to shrink our cube just a bit to this. So it's the same thing, same wibbly wobbly tiny whiny thing. Transform. And as of now, it is a non-struct because there's no structure in it. Now, if I add this structure here, which I call a four-eyes, which is essentially the relationship between four spheres that are closest drawn, by adding this and basically attaching, having the cubic frame hold on to that, now all of a sudden we've got a construct, which is to say this is now stable, because everything about it is triangulated. That's the main difference between before and after. And whenever we find a cubic shape within our manufactured reality that apparently lacks these diagonals, these square roots, then we can rest assured that the corners are rigid, which is to say there is micro-triangulation at play. And I'm just dropping these things here so we are, you know, rooted within reality. And just on a side note, here is a bigger cubic shape. That's the original length of those straws, and I had to cut a lot to make this triangulated this way. But this is actually the very so-called hexahedron that Brother Plato describes in the Timaeus. So do not ask me where the Platonic solids were stripped of their triangulation, because in Plato's own writing, the so-called hexahedron was clearly triangulated and therefore structurally sound. However, that's just a tangent. Let's get back to business. So let's say we are going to realize another house, another one of these big boxes that are, you know, keeping us all in cages, if you ask me. Now, the first and most significant tool to the masons or the stone builders, you know, those who set up the building blocks to make the big building, the main and first tool that they need is a string. So in our modern days, they would be using this kind of line here, which is a plastic kind of line. This is actually in German called Maurerschnur, which is to say it's the line that the mason uses to set up the walls. And there is two main directions at play within the so-called three-dimensional framework. And actually these two directions are at play within reality, in the reality of space-time. And those two, namely, are horizontal, about here, and vertical. The vertical is also called a plumb line. So if we do have a weight on a line, like here, the line, once it comes to more or less a resting position, that line is drawing inwards towards the heart of Earth, the center of gravity of our common kinship Earth. That's the one line. Now for the other line, the horizontal, nowadays people are using levels, which is essentially the main bit of action is a little tube with some liquid in it, some oil or water, and a bit of a bubble of air. Back in the old days, before that was around, the way to find level, to measure level, was to make an A-frame, which is essentially a large-scale compass, and with a bit of a, you know, like an A. And what one can do is to put a plumb line in the center node of that. I don't know if this actually shows. I can barely see the screen here. To drop a plumb line from the vertex of that compass and mark the two places. If we put this on the ground, we mark the two spots where the feet rest on the ground. That's important. And then we mark wherever the line of our plumb line crosses that A-frame, the A-bar in the A-frame. And then what we do is we have marked the spots on the ground, so we can just reverse the compass, put it down the other way around, and repeat the process. Again, mark the line of our vertical plumb line, and then when we have those two lines next to one another, when we find the means between those two lines, the center between the two, that's level. So once we have that, regardless of how uneven the ground was when we were measuring first, once we get that mean between these two places, we have the point of balance. We have the place where both legs now, whenever the line is in that place, the 2 feet of our compass are gonna be level. All right, so that is a lot of stuff about these lines. Another thing worth mentioning is that the line is not just used to find the vertical, the plumb line, but also to have a taut line that gives a straight line reference to set up the walls so they don't go like this. And while in geometry otherwise we speak of the ruler and divider, or if we don't take it as martial and as colonized, we can call them compass and straight edge. I think originally the straight edge comes from a taut line. That's the basis of that. The ruler or straight edge is really just a more rigid embodiment of that for ease of use. All right, so that's all. So we can agree on that. We can say our plumb line is our vertical, and the level is the water level, is the horizontal. So I don't know if you can already guess where this is going, but when we now define our so-called three-dimensional space, and we define it by these three axes, they call them X, Y, and Z. One part of the whole mental construct of that definition is to say that what we have here with the yellow lines, these are called normal because they are orthogonal to one another. They are perpendicular at right angles to one another. And the other thing that comes with that basic set of definitions is that we are suggesting that all of these vertical lines of our cube, all of these vertical lines are supposedly parallel, as well as the horizontal lines in one direction. Those are supposedly parallel. And I don't know about you, but I see some problem there. Why, you may ask? Well, you see, it's a mistake that is, we can accept where it comes from, because it's clear that for the people who came up with these ideas, they were rather small compared to the Earth, and from their vantage point, they were, probably given to the belief that these lines, these vertical lines, that they would drop anywhere, they would clearly be parallel because they are all orthogonal to the level and so forth. But in the meantime, and I mean even back then, some people were actually aware of the fact that the Earth is spherical, the Earth is round. And, because the big one that I'm hanging out on is a little too big, perhaps, to demonstrate what I'm trying to point out here, I'm gonna go for this one, which is just a little more accessible in size currently. Well, if we look at this Earth as a sphere, one thing becomes obvious. Where am I? I am sitting here in the far east of Germany, somewhere here. And if I want to build this box home, if I were to make it this big, it becomes quite obvious that there is a little bit of a incongruency between the statement that our vertical lines are parallel and the fact of the matter. What am I saying? I am saying that if indeed one is to to drop a plumb line on this sphere of Earth, the fact of the matter is wherever we are on Earth, it will always draw towards the center of the planet. In other words, what we call vertical can also be described as the radii or following the radii of the Earth. So in other words, if I'm moving around this sphere of Earth, my vertical line, regardless of my position, it's always going to be drawn towards the center of the planet. Because verticals are radii, there's one thing we can say with definitive clarity, which is they cannot be parallel. It should go without saying, but I don't think people are really aware of this. There's this entire debate between scientifically minded folks who say, well, the Earth is a sphere, and those who are less scientifically inclined who believe it is flat. Alas, the troubling matter of fact is that as long as anyone believes that space is three-dimensional, by that belief and its accompanying definitions, they are basically defining the Earth as at least flat, if not boxy. And I see a problem there. Okay, so that is the vertical lines. Yes, we can perhaps now agree that if I have this line drawn here and it's pointing to the center of Earth, and I move it ever so slightly over here and it's still pointing to the center of Earth, then those two lines cannot be parallel. They are going to be divergent outward and convergent inward. And you know, that is something we don't necessarily see manifest within the scales of our operations, unless we're building like a large scale bridge or some super high skyscrapers. In these cases, sometimes we do have those discrepancies, and if you look into synergetics by Bucky Fuller, there's a beautiful little diagram that shows the Earth, and then there's a bridge drawn on it, a specific one that he measured, which has, I think, a mile that it bridges, and the two towers of the bridge are therefore both being vertical, like they are both orthogonal to the ground in their place, but relative to one another they are not parallel but divergent, radially divergent. And I mean, you know, if we intend to actually scientifically understand and comprehend universe and our place in it, one should consider this as relevant and significant. All right, so that's the one direction, the vertical. However, I also want to draw our attention to a related flaw with regards to the horizontal. Because again, in the conventional geometry, they say that this square base of our cube is plane, and that plane goes off into infinity, whatever that is, wherever that is. But again, if we scale up our box in relation, or scale down our Earth, we find quickly that this is not true. This plane line cannot go to infinity unless it is tangent to Earth. Which is to say, let's take it the other way around. If we do have a water level with that little bubble in there, the shape of the bubble, it's a bit squished because of its confinement in that little tube. But if it wasn't squished, it would be clearly drawing into a sphere, as every bubble, as every droplet, as every puddle, as every lake and every ocean is drawn by its mass and its surface tension into spherical being. So, in other words, those lines that we define as horizontal, those aren't actually plane and parallel into infinity, but actually that line of reference, if this is our vertical line, the horizontal line is equivalent to what goes around this thing, to the circumference. It is the horizontal, the level, is drawing around Earth. It's not plane, it's not infinite, it's not straight. It's circumferential. And, you know, as a side note on that, in synergetics we do understand that radiation, as we already call it, is in fact operating radially, but it's only one half of a whole system, and the other side to that system is gravity, which operates circumferentially, meaning you and I and everybody on Earth, we're drawing together around the Earth, all together. And the sum total of that drawing togetherness is manifesting as our center of gravity that we're all moving towards. All right. So I've managed to lay out these troubles. Again, there's other further problems with the frame of mind of the box. Again, not least the fact that unless we triangulate it, it is non-structural and therefore invalid as any unit of anything. Neither is there a unit of a area here in terms of squares, nor is there a unit volume here. There's not even shape. But since I got this one in my hand, this model here in particular is my preferred model of systems change, if you like. And that's something a lot of people are asking for currently. And given the overwhelming violence and lethality of the current conditions of colonial civilization, I would argue it is worthwhile to, question the underlying assumptions, the underlying geometric definitions, because in those terms of this colonial geometry, a point is without body, without mass, without expanse. It's zero-dimensional. A line is one-dimensional. It's straight, goes to infinity, and if it is anything, it is divisive. So everyone has always got to choose which side of the line are you on. The plane, the aerial unit, then is the square. Hence, all of these wars that the colonial powers and empires have been fighting since time immemorial are fought over square kilometers and square miles of land on a spherical body of Earth. It's so blatantly obvious that this is all nonsense. But it is hegemonial nonsense and incredibly powerful at that. Okay, and then they come up with the volume in cubes, and therefore everyone is thinking in cubic meters or cubic miles or whatever, cubic feet when they speak of volume. And even the ice cubes are rounded cubes. When we actually look into what they call nature, as opposed to human nature, which is all those manufactured. Sorry for the disruption, my phone only records half an hour at a time. It's always a bit of a problem, because I never get done in less than that. I was saying that, you know, what this so-called nature, what I would call universe, because it includes us, we're members of it. We're not a part of nature, but we're members of universe. And the whole doesn't have parts unless we begin dividing and separating out whatever that is supposed to be. Again, that is all troubles of this geometry, because when they define the volume of the box, and they say, you know, in the plane they say, here's our area. Let's say this, I own this plot of land. I paid money for it, and I may have kicked out the native inhabitants of it, or whatever. If I do own that plot of land, I'm going to set up a border around it, and the border separates this plot of land from the world around it, and no one's allowed in or out. Same with the cubic volume, it's considered hermetically sealed. We only consider the inside, and the best thing one can do in the current state of mind is to think outside the box. Well, my suggestion is, sincerely, let's be without the box. We don't need that. And I'm getting there. Because in synergetics and spherical thinking and spherical being, we can identify a point with at least the center of gravity of a body, which also somehow already includes, or at least suggests, the presence of the expanse of the entire body up to its membrane. And this membrane, just as a triangle that I draw on the ground, it's not separating anything, it's not a borderline, it's actually a boundary, and the boundary is binding the whole into wholeness, because it binds the inside to the outside, and both together make the whole. So in other words, if I'm looking at my body, my boundary, my skin, isn't separating me out of anything. It's in fact binding my inside to my outside, and we share that outside, by the way. Our individual outsides are actually our common inside, because they're both embraced by kinship Earth. We're both immersed within the air ocean of this kinship Earth. So, let's do the shift that I spoke of, the mind shift, the paradigm shift. And here is that disentangled model of that was incapable of holding the shape of the cube. And let's see what happens if we triangulate rather than go in squares. And just like that, even here I already got something. I've got a triangle which unfolds in two directions, because contrary to the square and the cube, which are uniform, meaning if I unfold them, all I ever get are squares and cubes, in terms of triangles and the spherical structures of space-time, turns out they are polyform. So even if I only unfold a single one in two, it's already looking two ways, and it's a complementary thing. Both together make the whole. Plus it's actually dynamically shifting and changing its shape. And that remains the case as we keep triangulating around this thing. Also, I call the triangles, these triangles are left angles to me because they have 60 degrees. They call them equilateral. I call them left angles because if we say 90 degrees is right angle, that's called a 60 degree left angle. But I also call them eyes. And why is that? Because if I do have a triangle of spheres, you can take any three spheres that you have lying around. If you make put them into a triangle, you find that there is actually a little gap between them where you can look through. In other words, there's an eye, like the eye of a needle or the eye of the storm. And that's why I call these eyes, and I call these structures many eyes. And this right now would be considered a pyramid, a square-based pyramid in conventional geometry. However, in synergetics it becomes obvious that this isn't a square base. The square isn't there. It's a gap between the triangles, allowing them to move, just as any four-legged being moves. And we continue on from here, we go into the next, and it almost looks a bit like a snail, and yet another one coming into place. And we have this beautiful shapeshifter, you know, still nice and dynamic. And here we go, closing the entire thing. Now it's omnitriangulated, it's a stable and structurally sound body, binding its inside to its outside. And we can, you know, rather than using that nonsensical frame of the cube all the time, which is falling way short of being a useful and apt model of reality, we can play with these, because they are basically the shapes that come out of the interplay of spheres. And one may see here in this another one last point, if you like, that I want to bring up. So first, before we get to the last point, here is, you remember this, I call this the 2 dozen 8 eyes, or tau dozen 8 eyes, or indeed in synergetics terms it's the vector equilibrium, because all of these fingers, as I call them, these vectors, are actually of the same length. So whether we are moving circumferentially around the system or radially in or out of the system, we are only ever one step at a time. There's only one length, one direction, and so far, no, not one direction. Actually, in the center we have a dozen directions to go to. But any which way in this system that we choose to go is going to be the shortest way, the shortest path of least resistance, which is a common denominator of everything in the universe except our manufactured reality and its outcomes. Because in that world we superimpose another level of complexity onto the beautiful simplicity of reality, introducing the need to round afterwards and all that. And that is because, and I'm just going to bring this up quickly, in conventional terms, as I said, these are the normals. And then, you know, this would be a unit, 1, and then the square would be 1 by 1, 1 square unit, and the cube would be 1 by 1 by 1, a cubic unit. And if we define that, everything about cubes and squares is neat and easy, except that the triangle in here, that eye of the 4 eyes that we placed inside of this, that is rendered irrational, because already this line here is called the square root of 2. If this is 1, then that's the square root of 2, which is an irrational number without any end to it. And subsequently the area of this triangle is irrational, as is the volume of this 4 eyes in terms of cubic units. It's irrational. That's, I think, the origin of quite a lot of our problems and paradoxes that we find still within all kinds of sciences and so forth. Because we can do a simple change in this definition and say, rather than saying that this is our normal unit and hence this becomes abnormal, let's say this so-called square root, that's our unit. So if that is 1, then the square side square root plus minus a half, or minus square root a half. Those become irrational, but arguably that is a lot more reasonable. And if this square root instead becomes our unit 1, then the triangle area is 1, and the unit of the 4i's in here is equally 1. 1 quantum volume, as we would call it. And the actual volume of this particular size of a cube in that specific relationship is not irrational, it's 3 quantum volumes. 3 quanta. At the same time, our 8i's here, which is the same number of straws as the yellow ones of the cube, except for the additional 4i's in there. This is just a dozen straws, and the volume of this, in terms of that quantum volume that we just spoke of, the volume of this 8i's here is in fact 4 quanta. So it's more volume for less effort and less material and so forth. It's also got a smaller surface in relation to its volume, so in terms of building houses, for instance, it would be worthwhile, not just because this house wouldn't collapse in case of an earthquake, or we could just put it on tripod if we wanted to have it above the rising sea level. No, not just that. It actually, because of its shape, has more positive qualities in terms of the capacity of maintaining and regulating its body temperature. So while in our box homes we are wasting enormous amounts of energy to heat them in the winter and cool them in the summer, to the point where most of the modern box homes have little boxes outside which are ACs, climate control. Contrary to that, if we are actually building and inhabiting these structures of space-time as such, my point is that we wouldn't be wasting half as much. We wouldn't be wasting energy, because we would actually be applying synergy. That's quite a paradigm shift. Alright, but I want to just bring these straws back to a little more comprehensible place, where these straws are already showing a relationship among spheres, but we can look at the spheres. So if this was 1, that's the same thing as this vector equilibrium, just a little smaller. In fact, here is one even smaller. This is a dozen spheres around 1. If we were to look at the spheres in there, and I do not have a model of that with me right now, except for a tiny little one which is too small to show. But if we take this vector equilibrium as a sphere, as a very easily applicable frame of reference for any sphere that we're looking at, because we do have the circumference manifest in these vectors that go around the membrane, and the same scale of vectors going to the heart of this. So the radii and the circumferential vectors are of the same length, and we can easily increase the frequency, meaning like an onion, having layers and layers and layers more of these spheres around here. And whatever frequency, even if it was 12 frequency, then it would be 12 intervals, 12 steps along the edge on the outside, on the circumference of the structure, as well as a dozen steps to the heart. See, it's useful, this one. And what happens if we have more than 1? So here I've got 4 of them, and these 4 are closest drawn into the arrangement that actually manifests the 4i's. So allow me to strip off this rather obsolete and useless mental blockage of this building block of civilization. We don't need that anymore. And if we look only at this, the four corners of this are actually the centers of these four spheres. Right? And similarly, if we go a step further and take the 8 eyes here, we have this, which is 6 spheres closest drawn into that arrangement. So that's just to give an example of how these, there's incredible amounts of dynamism and a capacity to shift to zero in, so to speak, on various aspects of these things. In fact, if we follow the logic of synergetics, which I suggest, this very vector equilibrium is the actual geometry of zero, because zero has a shape. And there's a lot to say about that, which I won't now, except we'll take this last look at another variation of this particular model. This is also a vector equilibrium, and notice how it dances. That's actually something the vector equilibrium inherently does. So even this one here, see how it shakes, it moves, it dances, because equilibrium, balance, is inherently dynamic. It's going this and that way, back and forth, like the waves on the ocean, balance du mar. And this dance that is already suggested in this little bit of a wiggle continues. We can actually contract the thing, the membrane, towards the center of this. Oops. There. And by doing so, the dozen vectors that are the radii of our vector equilibrium now draw together in pairs to make 6 of them. And this is my final point. In geometry as we know it, as the convention has it, these 6 directions are those 3 axes of the 3-dimensional space, right? So if I place this here, one can see that this could sit in there. So the center of this would be the point of origin of our coordinate system. But the way that we already agreed, or we can see now that the vertical and the horizontal aren't what they are made out to be, this is actually showing us that within the mindset of the cube, if this is the cube sitting on the ground like that, this 8 eyes that sits within it, now here's something I haven't shown you yet. These are closest drawn spheres, namely this is 6, a dozen and 2. Their connections look like this, and that is what I call the 2 dozen around 8 eyes. There's many names for this, but this is the inside out of the vector equilibrium. And one can see how if I have these suspended like that, the plumb line goes through them like this, and these actual triangular planes in here are level with the ground, horizontal. So rather than having the box sit on the ground like this, we have it sit like that, or dance rather. If we do sit down the box on the ground like that, we are suddenly saying that the 8 eyes in the box, the one that is being ignored by the box, is sitting on the tip like that, reminiscent of the pyramid, of that, you know, hierarchy where one is above the other, rather than a polycentric system where everybody belongs together and there's no above or below. But in reality, if I do have a system like these spheres here, and they do sit down on the ground, they do so in regardless of the levelness of the ground, because on a tripod only always defines, like the one you're sitting on with the camera right now, it's sitting on a plane which is defined by the three legs, by the 3 points. Same here. It's sitting flush on the ground, and it's not like this. This would be X, Y, Z, the box thing, and we're doing this. Simple as that. So our vertical line that we have for reference is actually going straight through this whole system. Here, let's take a vector equilibrium there. That line goes through here, which is to say that the hexagonal circumference, or this one of the 4 hexagonal planes in the vector equilibrium here, is actually level with the circumference of the Earth. Yeah, that is, you know, just to give a sense of this shift, because we're stuck in this place. Space-time would only be in this relationship to the ground if it were moving. If I have it orbiting or dancing like that, spinning. And the moment it comes to rest, it sits down like this. And I would suggest let's do that all together. And, you know, again, I could tell you so much more about this, and I could show so much more about this. This is really just, as I like to say, it's the snowflake on the tip of the iceberg. And there's a whole ocean there to be comprehended and fathomed. But for lack of time and, you know, to make it digestible, I suppose, I'm gonna keep it there. But I want to just quickly, I don't have all the essentials to show the entirety of this thing to you. I left some out. But I'll show you what happens if I take out the nucleus of this, just to give you a sense of the entirety of the dance of the Tao, or as Bucky Fuller called it, the jitterbug, which is the transformation that is inherent in space-time. It's the thing that all electromagnetic radiation is doing, for instance. Which is to say that our membrane here is actually dancing, and within that dance it's moving from one side to the other, because that's balance. And it is doing this contracting and expanding and contracting again. And then we can spin it a bit, like that, and like that. Get here, and we have the 4 eyes, and the inverse, because space-time has inside and outside. And we can even go all the way to fold it down into a single eye. Well, maybe not today. My model is a bit old already. Yeah. So all of that transformation, that shift, that shape shift and ape shift is already embodied and present in any single eye, in any single triangle. At least in any living triangle. Because this is my final sentiment I want to suggest. The ancient geometry of the Greek metaphysics is lifeless. It's pure abstraction, and there's no bodiness in it. And what synergetics, or spherical thinking, the way of the sphere, provides us with is an actual way to reanimate geometry. So just as we're getting back into animism in our understanding of our relationship with Earth and life, we can see that contrary to the colonial geometries, the actual living, breathing geometry of space-time is anything but static. It's wholly dynamic. Every wave, every particle is a wave knotted in on itself, and every wave has particular aspects to it in the way it as a whole behaves. And with that in mind, I thank you for your attention, very much so. I hope you get something out of this, and perhaps leave a comment, or if you have any questions, please go ahead and tell me. And with that, again, I will soon do a video, a deep dive in the problems with the Platonic solids, the so-called Platonic solids. I will also do another deep dive into the Tetractys as promised, but those have to wait a little. And for now, this is where I leave you. I hope this was, inspiring, perhaps a little bit. What is a good word for this? I hope it broadens the point of view of yours, and I hope it stimulates further thought. And please, with all of this, as Bucky asked us in the beginning of Synergetics, dare to be naive, because none of this is identical to any degree with the geometry of conventions, of colonialism that we've been taught. All of those are abstractions and really invalid when it comes to the reality of space-time. But to learn about that reality, one doesn't need to be studied. One can actually just go ahead and play with these spheres and see how they behave and get a grip, get a hold of this, and get a felt understanding, or maybe even an inner standing of these principles at play, and in the end play by heart with all of this. Because you may see that I'm sitting in this nice little swing here, which is attached to this tree ship, which is the same kind of thing as this, just with wildwood tied together with knots and rope. And it is suggestive of the possibilities that we do have as a species among all our kin on this kinship Earth, if only we allow ourselves to dare to be naive and tune back into the harmony of the spheres, no pun intended, tune back into the principles at play that keep unfolding and manifesting all these various layers of being, the web of life in all its complexity, that complement one another into the whole of universe. So with that, peace be with you. Take care.